Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, mainly centered around the Donetsk region. The Russians managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Serebriansky and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Russians also managed to advance in the northern flank of Pokrovsk in the direction of Mirnorod and recapturing Nykanorivka. The Russians also managed to advance within the Serebriansky forest area, gaining full control over the encircled group of Ukrainian forces in the eastern parts of the Serebriansky forest area. The Russians also managed to advance in the Borova direction, where the Ukrainians also managed to counterattack and regain some positions. So there's a bit of a back and forth in that direction. As for the Ukrainian counterattack operations in the eastern section of the front line, there are no developments over the past 24 hours. That is not to say that the Ukrainian counterattack has ended. However, they are now establishing a front line looking to prevent further Russian advances and breakthroughs of the Ukrainian lines. We'll also see more local counterattacks by the Ukrainians to improve their positions around Pokrovsk and in the different areas where the Russians are launching offensive operations here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russian advances in the southwestern outskirts include advancing within Temerivka, gaining control over the remaining parts of the town yet again, while also managing to gain control over some fortified positions along the border area between the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians here managed to advance following the capture of some fortified positions to the east in the Donetsk region, to advance in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region and into the Zaporizhia region, gaining control over the northern parts of Temerivka and then storming the fortified positions from the eastern and southern directions. Gaining control of these fortified positions are only half of them, as there is still some that remains to the northwest of Temerivka, north of Obratne, following which the Russians will gain control over the northern flank of these settlements and continue offensive operations along the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region. It will also allow the Russians to start offensive operations in the direction of Kumyshevacha from the southern direction, as several fortified positions would be moved out of the way. However, the Ukrainians still have the second line of defense within the Dnipropetrovsk region, reaching into the Donetsk region, which the Russians are also fighting over through Makiyivka, Sechneve, and Vorona in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Despite Ukrainian attempts to destabilize the Russian offensive operations and stop them, with regaining some positions in the northern direction, the Russians continue their offensive operations to gain control over the southwestern outskirts and into the defensive lines of the Zaporizhia region. In the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians launched an offensive towards the industrial area. Following the initial capture of the eastern parts of the industrial area here west of Nykanorivka, Russians are expanding their zone of control south of the waste heap, attacking the industrial areas in the northeastern outskirts of Mirnorod. Russians are here working on gaining a foothold within the northern parts of Mirnorod for offensive operations, securing the southern flank of the push in the direction of Rodinsk, and to establish themselves within one of the two cities here in the Pokrovsk-Mirnorod direction. Russians will be working on gaining control over Mirnorod to secure the area from Novhradivka up along the railway towards the western flank of Mirnorod and through the railway towards the southern parts as well. With their control over the eastern road, the Russians will look to gain a foothold in the northern and eastern directions. This will all allow the Russians to attack Mirnorod from several directions and put pressure on the supply lines leading into the city and spread out the Ukrainian forces defending the two cities. Further north, the Russians managed to recapture Nykanorivka following the Ukrainian counterattack, securing the flanks of the offensive operations in the direction of Kucherev Yar. Russians are here working on stabilizing the flanks following the Ukrainian counterattacks to hold their positions at the tip of their offensive operations, while also developing offensive operations to secure the western flank along the fortified positions, the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth lines, which will allow the Russians to establish a defensive line to the west with the river line to the east. The Russians would have strong flanks for securing the flanks of defensive operations. At the same time, also allow the Russians to focus their forces and concentrate them in the directions of Mirnorod, Rodinsk, and the operations in the northern and western directions. Moving on to the Serebriansky forest area, the Russians have managed to close the pocket, getting full control over the fortified positions in the eastern parts of the Serebriansky forest area. And this is a significant development because now, for the first time in 3 years, the Russians have control over the southern flank of Kremenna. This secures the road between Kremenna and Torsk from Ukrainian FPV drone activity for the most part, except for the closer they get to the front line in Torsk, the more difficult it becomes. However, with these additional supply lines that are now more secure, the city itself being secure, and supply lines moving through the northern flank into Nykanorivka, Serebriansky, Nove, are all much more secure with the capture of the Serebriansky forest area in the eastern parts. This was also a large concentration of infantry on both sides, which will now be moving further westwards along the Serebriansky forest area all the way to the Serebriansky river line. All of these developments all have significant impact on this section of the front line as a whole. The Russians would have a lot of infantry being freed up for the offensive operations moving further westwards. The fact that the fortified positions are now mostly captured and remaining parts not having that much fortified positions will allow the Russians to make faster advances towards the Serebryansky river line and gain control over the area north of Siversk in the Serebriansky forest area and the eastern parts of it. The Russians will then strengthen their positions for offensive operations towards Siversk, the northern defensive line, and entering the town from the north, while at the same time threatening Liman from the east. At the same time, the Russians have better supply lines towards Torsk, which will strengthen their offensive capabilities across the Serebriansky river line towards Sarishne, and the supply lines towards Nove in the northern flank in the western bank of the Serebriansky river line for offensive operations going towards Novoselivka, Liman, and so on here in the northern bank of the Southwestern Donetsk river line. The Serebriansky forest area has been one of the meat grinders of this war, where a lot of infantry has been fighting within it for 3 years now. The fighting taking place within Serebriansky forest area is very difficult. There's very dense trees, a lot of fortifications, and a lot of infantry. The Russians and the Ukrainians have been fighting face to face in this forest area since the Ukrainians first recaptured it following their Kharkiv offensive in 2022. This led to Ukrainian offensive operations in the direction of Kremenna, which never managed to reach the city. Instead, the Russians established a defensive line and fortifications were built along the front line. The front line had not moved further than these fortified positions for these years, and now that the Russians have managed to encircle them and cut off their escape, gain control over the fortified positions, and now have the road all the way to the southern flank of Torsk under their control, with the Ukrainian positions mainly being at the marshlands to the south of the Serebriansky forest area north of Serebrianka. It's likely the Russians will quickly gain control over the remaining parts leading up to Nykanorivka and the northern flank of Siversk, which will then lead to a less dense area of the forest area, with the settlements such as Yempil, Dibrova, Ozerne located within the forest areas, some clearings, and some additional defensive fortifications on the western bank of the Serebriansky river line, while the Ukrainian presence on the eastern bank of the Serebriansky river line is now much smaller than it used to be. Therefore, the Russians will likely strengthen the offensive operations within the Serebriansky forest area to gain full control of it, not just the eastern bank of the Serebriansky river line, but all the way to Liman and the southern parts of the city, to enter Liman from the southern direction, as well as to gain control of the southern flanks of Sarishne and the positions here in the eastern flank of Liman and the northern flank of the Siversk section of the front line. The Russians getting control over the Serebriansky forest area will also allow them to launch offensive operations along the Southwestern Donetsk canal to gain control over everything behind Siversk, with a combined push towards the town itself from multiple directions, hitting the Ukrainian forces within the pocket, and then creating an encirclement by pushing up towards the Southwestern Donetsk river along the Southwestern Donetsk canal on the eastern parts of it through Orihova, Slivka, Sinkivka, and other directions of the front line that have been stagnant since the Russian capture of Bakhmut in 2023. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance west of Lozova, gain control over the northern bank of the river line as well as the first line, while the Ukrainians recaptured the fortified position here to the north of Temerivka. The Russians are here working on the flanks of the Ukrainian forces counterattacking to gain control over the first lines leading up to the fortified positions, secure the northern flank, and start fighting over these fortified positions, where the Ukrainians have started building anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth. Even here on the southern flank, some of the satellite imageries have been updated, some have not. The updated parts shows the dragon teeth lines. So we see that the Ukrainians have prepared fortifications on both sides of these fortified positions north of Nykanorivka, to which the Russians' offensive operations were stopped by these fortifications and instead redirected towards Serebryansky in the south, and now in the northern flank as well, where the Ukrainians are also counterattacking to improve their positions and dislodge the Russian army from these fortified positions and cut off their supply lines. The Russians will then respond by counterattacking and cutting off the Ukrainian forces in the area. The frontline developments across the front line are all centered around the Russian offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line, from the southern outskirts of the Donetsk region to the eastern bank of the Usk River line. The Ukrainian General Staffs Zelensky and Syrsky are all day-to-day warning of an upcoming Russian offensive in the Zaporizhia and Pokrovsk directions. They're expecting a large-scale offensive by the Russians in the coming days. Over the past few days, they have been warning about it every single day. Zelensky and Trump are meeting in the White House today, where they'll be talking about the outcome of the discussion between Trump and Putin, where Putin managed to convince Trump that no ceasefire is needed. Instead, they should only be working towards a quick peace settlement. The last time Zelensky visited the White House, he was humiliated on live TV, after which he left. To avoid such a repetition this time around, he is coming with backup, as several European leaders, including the Finnish, German, and British leaders, are going to be joining him in the meeting. It'll be a large meeting between many European countries, Zelensky and Trump, as well as JD Vance. All of them will be talking about the meeting in Alaska with Putin and a potential for a peace deal based on the conditions that Putin set forward, to either come with a counter proposal or accept the Russian proposal. So far, Zelensky has outright refused basically every point in the Russian proposal, even after Putin ended up giving some concessions, such as stopping the war along the front line in the Serebriansky and Kherson region, despite initially saying that they wanted full control over all four regions. This means we are unlikely to see any conclusion to the war based on these negotiations, but it's still worth following just to see what Trump does going forward after yet another rejection. This meeting will take place today. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.